Welcome back to the channel. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. If someone had told you back in the 1970s that you could leave London after breakfast, cross the entire Atlantic Ocean, and arrive in New York before breakfast on the same day, local time, what would you have thought? That it was science fiction? That it was the kind of thing reserved for astronauts, heads of state, and the most powerful people on Earth? And yet, for nearly 3 decades, that journey was available. Not to astronauts, not to the military, to anyone willing to pay the price of a first-class ticket on the most extraordinary passenger aircraft ever built. Its name, of course, was Concorde. And today, we are going to travel back in time together, not to admire a machine, but to step inside one of the most rarefied, exclusive, and genuinely astonishing passenger experiences the world of aviation has ever known. Sit back, close your eyes for a moment if you like, and let me take you there. Imagine standing at Terminal 4 at Heathrow Airport in 1985. Or perhaps it is JFK in New York, and the year is 1992. You are dressed well because you always dress well when you travel on Concorde. Around you, the other passengers are bankers, diplomats, film stars, fashion executives, and a handful of people whose names you would recognize from the newspaper. The lounge you are sitting in is quiet, unhurried, and elegant. There is no crush, no chaos, no interminable queue snaking around a corner. There are perhaps 100 passengers on the entire aircraft, and already before you have even walked through the boarding door, do you understand that this is not like any other way of flying? This is something else entirely. You walk down the jetway and step through the narrow door into the cabin. The first thing that strikes you is how intimate it feels, how close the ceiling sits above your head, how the windows, small and oval, line the fuselage like a row of portholes on a very elegant, very fast ocean liner. But then you settle into your seat, a seat that is genuinely comfortable, upholstered in fine fabric, with real leather in later years, and a footrest that actually works, and you begin to feel it. Not the size of the aircraft, because Concorde is not large, not the grandeur of the space, because the cabin is narrow and relatively modest. What you feel is something much harder to describe. A sense of privilege, a sense of occasion, or a sense that you are about to do something that almost no one in the history of the world had ever done before. Travel between continents at twice the speed of sound in absolute comfort, with a glass of champagne in your hand and the curve of the earth visible through the window above you. Can you imagine sitting on an aircraft and seeing the curvature of the earth with your own eyes? This is where one begins to understand that Concorde was not simply a fast aeroplane. It was a portal to a different experience of what it meant to be alive in the 20th century. But let us slow down for a moment, because to truly appreciate what Concorde represented, we need to understand where it came from and what it was trying to do. The story begins in the late 1950s, when Britain and France, the two nations still in the long process of reinventing themselves in the post-war world, began to dream of something audacious. The jet age had arrived. The Boeing 707 had entered service in 1958 and had transformed transatlantic travel, shrinking the ocean from a 5-day sea crossing to a 7-hour flight. But already the engineers and visionaries on both sides of the English Channel were asking a more daring question. What if you could do it in 3 hours? The technical challenge was almost incomprehensible. To fly at twice the speed of sound, at altitudes of over 50,000 feet, with 100 passengers on board, required solving problems that had never been solved before. The airframe had to withstand temperatures of over 120 degrees Celsius on its outer skin from aerodynamic friction alone, or temperatures hot enough to cause the aircraft to expand by as much as 30 centimeters in flight. The engines had to operate efficiently at conditions that no commercial jet engine had ever faced. The fuel system had to be intelligent enough to pump fuel between tanks during flight, to shift the aircraft's center of gravity, as it transitioned between subsonic and supersonic speeds. Every single element of the aircraft was, in the most literal sense, beyond the frontier of what had ever been attempted. The governments of Britain and France signed the treaty that officially launched the Concorde project in November 1962. It was a partnership born of ambition and, to some extent, mutual strategic necessity. Neither country could afford the program alone. Together, they would build something that no other nation in the world had come close to achieving. The Americans were working on their own supersonic transport at the time, and the Soviets had their Tupolev Tu-144, but neither would ever come close to the elegance, the reliability, or the longevity of Concorde. Concorde first flew in March 1969, the same year that men walked on the moon. Think about that for a moment. The same 12 months that saw human beings step onto the surface of another world also saw the first sustained supersonic test flight of a passenger aircraft that would eventually carry paying customers at Mach 2 across the Atlantic. It was, in every sense, the most extraordinary period of technological ambition in human history, and Concorde sat right at the heart of it. The prototype that flew in 1969 was not yet the Concorde that passengers would eventually know. Years of refinement, testing, and development followed. There were 20 production aircraft in total, of which 14 entered commercial service, 7 with British Airways, and 7 with Air France. The first commercial flights took place simultaneously on the 21st of January 1976, one from London to Bahrain and one from Paris to Dakar. The transatlantic service to New York began in November 1977, after an extraordinary political battle with American authorities who initially banned Concorde from landing, partly on environmental grounds and partly, one suspects, because it was simply too much of a humiliation for American aviation pride to accept a European aircraft doing something the United States could not. But here is the thing. Once Concorde began flying to New York, everything changed. The aircraft became, almost immediately, a cultural icon of a kind that no aeroplane before or since has quite managed to equal. It was not simply that it was fast, though the speed was, of course, extraordinary. It was that the combination of speed and luxury created an experience that was genuinely unlike anything else in the world. And it is that experience that I want to describe to you now, in as much detail and as much richness as I can, because if you never flew on Concorde, and the vast majority of people never did, you deserve to know what you missed. Let us begin at the beginning. The check-in experience on Concorde was already different. At Heathrow, British Airways Concorde passengers checked in at a dedicated terminal facility, and separate from the main terminal building, where the queues were short, the staff were attentive, and the sense of occasion was carefully managed. You did not feel like a passenger being processed. You felt like a guest being welcomed. This distinction, which might sound small, was absolutely central to the Concorde experience. From the very first moment of your journey, you were made to feel that this was a special event, something to be savored rather than endured. The dedicated Concorde lounge at Heathrow was a genuinely fine place to spend time. Comfortable armchairs, attentive service, good food and excellent drinks, the Financial Times and the International Herald Tribune laid out with care, and a quiet, club-like atmosphere that owed more to a good London hotel than to any conventional airport lounge. The passengers around you were interesting people. You might find yourself exchanging a few words with a senior executive from one of the major American banks, or a well-known actor traveling to Hollywood for a meeting, or a European politician heading to Washington for talks that would not be reported until the following week. Concorde attracted the kind of people who did not need to impress anyone because they had already arrived. And there was a particular quality to the conversation in those lounges, a certain ease, a certain mutual understanding that everyone present had earned their place there in one way or another. The most surprising thing is that this really happened. Every day for nearly 3 decades, this ritual was repeated. This world existed. And then it stopped. When the boarding call came, it was unhurried and gracious. You walked to the gate and through the jetway into the aircraft, and the first adjustment you made was physical. Concorde's fuselage was narrow, noticeably narrower than a conventional wide-body jet. The cabin was configured with 2 seats on each side of the aisle, a 2-2 layout running the length of the aircraft, which gave each passenger considerably more personal space than you might have expected, and a sense of intimacy that felt more like a private dining room than a commercial aircraft cabin. There were exactly 100 seats in total, 100 passengers, and that was it. No middle class, no rear section filled with holidaymakers, no long queue for the bathroom shared between 300 people. 100 privileged individuals, and an attentive crew trained to the highest possible standard. The seats themselves evolved over the years. In the early days of Concorde service, they were relatively conventional aircraft seats, albeit comfortable and well-appointed. As the years passed and competition for the Concorde passengers' favour intensified, British Airways in particular invested heavily in upgrading the interior. By the late 1980s and 1990s, the seats had become genuinely luxurious, with leather upholstery, good lumbar support, and a footrest arrangement that made the relatively modest seat pitch, which was around 38 inches, perfectly comfortable for the duration of a 3.5-hour flight. And 3.5 hours, of course, was the duration. London to New York in 3.5 hours. The time it takes to watch a long film. The time it takes to have a leisurely lunch. Not a journey to be endured, but barely even a journey at all. The food and drink on Concorde deserve their own extended discussion because they were genuinely extraordinary by any standard, not just by the standard of airline catering. British Airways worked with some of the finest suppliers in Britain to create a menu that was worthy of the experience surrounding it. In the early years, the catering was prepared by a variety of contracted suppliers, but by the 1980s and 1990s, British Airways had established relationships with premium food providers and had developed a Concorde menu that was changed regularly, seasonally, and with real culinary ambition. A typical flight from London to New York in the mid-1990s might begin almost immediately after takeoff, with a glass of Laurent Perrier Grand Siècle champagne, one of the finest available anywhere in the world, poured without being asked by a cabin crew member who had already learnt your name during boarding. The amuse-bouche that followed might be smoked Scottish salmon with crème fraîche and capers, served on fine porcelain with proper silverware. The starter could be a terrine of foie gras with sauterne jelly and toasted brioche. The main course on a morning flight might be eggs Benedict prepared to order, or on an evening service, a fillet of beef with truffle jus, accompanied by seasonal vegetables and a sauce that would not have embarrassed a Michelin-starred kitchen. The dessert was always something worth the name. A warm chocolate fondant, a perfectly ripe selection of French and British cheeses, a crème brûlée that had been prepared with the kind of attention to detail that reminded you these were not airline caterers working to a budget, but professionals who understood that the passengers they were serving were accustomed to the best. Can you imagine boarding an aircraft for a crossing of the Atlantic and being served food of this quality, on proper china, with proper silver cutlery, in under 3.5 hours? This is where one begins to understand that Concorde was not competing with other airlines. It was competing with the finest hotels and restaurants in the world, and for the most part, it held its own with surprising ease. The wine list deserves separate mention. British Airways stocked Concorde with wines that were, by any measure, exceptional. Grand Cru Burgundy, first growth Bordeaux in good years, a Puligny-Montrachet of genuine quality, and a dessert wine program that included Chateau d'Yquem in the right vintage. These were not token gestures toward quality. They were serious choices made by serious people who understood that the passengers on Concorde had eaten in the best restaurants in Paris and New York and London and expected to be met at their own level. In many cases they were. The cabin crew on Concorde were, by all accounts from passengers who flew regularly, the best in the business. They were selected carefully, trained extensively, and they understood something that is very rare in any service industry: the difference between service and civility. On Concorde, you were served, but you were never made to feel that your attendant was beneath you. The relationship was one of mutual professionalism and mutual respect, calibrated to a very precise social register that both parties understood intuitively. These were men and women who could discuss the wine list with genuine knowledge, who remembered your preference for still or sparkling water from one flight to the next, and who managed the dynamics of a cabin full of powerful, accustomed-to-deference personalities with extraordinary skill and tact. Now let us talk about the flight itself, because the experience of flying on Concorde was not merely a luxurious imitation of a normal flight. It was physically, measurably, demonstrably different in ways that passengers described consistently over the years as among the most profound sensory experiences of their lives. The takeoff was the first revelation. Concorde used afterburners, known technically as reheat, on its Olympus engines during the takeoff roll, and the result was an acceleration that was simply unlike anything a normal passenger aircraft could produce. Passengers described being pressed into their seats with a force that felt, in the early moments, more like a space launch than an aeroplane departure. The noise inside the cabin was significant, though well managed by the soundproofing of the interior. But there was a deep, visceral rumble that you felt as much in your chest as you heard with your ears. The aircraft rotated at a steep angle, climbing rapidly and powerfully, and within minutes it was already at altitudes that subsonic jets would not reach for another hour of flight. The transition through the sound barrier was, counterintuitively, one of the gentler moments of the flight. Passengers who had never flown supersonically sometimes expected a dramatic event, a bang, a shudder, a moment of physical disruption. There was none. The sonic boom, of course, was real, but it happened behind the aircraft and below it, rolling across the ocean and occasionally rattling the windows of fishing boats far beneath. Inside the cabin, the transition from subsonic to supersonic was announced not by turbulence or noise, but by a small display mounted in the forward cabin that showed the Mach number. When it clicked past 1.0 and continued climbing toward 2.0, passengers would sometimes raise their glasses in a quiet, private toast to the moment. Mach 1, the speed of sound, and the aircraft still accelerating. By the time Concorde reached its cruising speed of Mach 2.02, roughly 2,000, at 160 kilometers per hour, it was flying at an altitude of between 50,000 and 60,000 feet. This is where the experience became truly extraordinary, and where no amount of description can entirely do justice to what passengers actually saw and felt. At 60,000 feet, you are not merely above the clouds. You are above most of the atmosphere. The sky above you is not blue in the way it appears from the ground. It is a deep, saturated, almost violet blue that darkens toward the zenith in a way that tells your eyes, instinctively, that there is not much atmosphere left above you. On a clear day, on the right side of the aircraft, facing west on the London to New York route, you could see the curvature of the Earth. Not a dramatic curve, not the extreme fisheye view of an astronaut, but a gentle, unmistakable, scientifically verifiable curve of the planet's horizon that reminded you, with sudden and unexpected emotional force, that you were looking at the Earth from the edge of space. Passengers who flew Concorde regularly mentioned this view again and again in their accounts of the experience. It was not something you became accustomed to. Every flight, that moment of looking out of the small oval window at the dark sky above and the curve of the world below, produced a feeling that many described as close to awe. A British businessman who flew Concorde more than 50 times over the course of a decade wrote in a memoir that the view from 60,000 feet was the single most beautiful thing he had ever seen, more beautiful than any painting, more affecting than any landscape, more humbling than any cathedral. There is something about seeing the shape of the world from outside it that no other experience in peacetime civilian life could provide, and Concorde provided it, regularly, reliably, to anyone who could afford the ticket. Speaking of tickets, let us address, directly and without embarrassment, the question of price, because Concorde was not cheap and was never intended to be. A return ticket from London to New York on Concorde in the mid-1990s cost approximately £7,000. In today's money, accounting for inflation, that is somewhere in the region of £15,000 to £17,000 for a return journey. This was not first-class pricing. It was beyond first-class pricing. It was a category of its own, and it was priced to reflect not just the luxury of the experience, but the extraordinary operating costs of the aircraft, and, frankly, the simple fact that there was no alternative. If you wanted to fly at Mach 2 between London and New York, you flew Concorde. There was no other option, no competitor, no budget version of the supersonic experience. You paid the price, or you took a subsonic flight and arrived several hours later. And enough people chose to pay that Concorde was, for most of its commercial life, a genuinely profitable route for British Airways, which is a fact that surprises many people when they first encounter it. The passenger list on any given Concorde flight was, as a result, a remarkable document of the times. Mick Jagger flew Concorde so regularly that the British Airways staff knew his preferences in advance. A Joan Collins flew it. Paul McCartney flew it. Princess Diana flew it. Phil Collins famously flew Concorde from London to New York, and then caught a helicopter to continue to a concert on the same day, a piece of logistics that would have been literally impossible on any other aircraft, and which became one of the most celebrated examples of Concorde's transformative effect on the geography of time. Corporate executives from the major banks and law firms on both sides of the Atlantic flew Concorde routinely as a productivity tool because the arithmetic was straightforward. If you could save 4 or 5 hours of a senior partner's time twice a week for a year, the cost of the ticket was trivial compared to the value of the time recovered. Concorde was, in this sense, not merely a luxury but a genuinely rational business decision for a certain tier of professional life. There were also, of course, the one-time travelers, the people who saved for years to fly on Concorde for a significant birthday or anniversary, who flew once and spoke about it for the rest of their lives. The retired couple from the English Midlands who booked a return Concorde flight to New York to celebrate 40 years of marriage and who described, in letters to British Airways published in the company's magazine, the extraordinary kindness and attentiveness of the cabin crew, the champagne at breakfast, the dark blue sky above, the feeling of arriving in New York before they had left London by the clock. These accounts have a particular tenderness to them. They remind you that Concorde was not merely the province of the famous and the wealthy, but that it touched, occasionally, the lives of perfectly ordinary people who happened to want, just once, to know what the extraordinary felt like. This is where one begins to understand that Concorde was more than an aircraft. It was, for the people who flew it, a transformative experience in the fullest sense of that phrase. Let us talk for a moment about what it felt like to land on Concorde, because the arrival into New York's JFK Airport on a Concorde flight was an event in itself. The aircraft descended steeply, at a much greater angle than a conventional jet, with the nose drooped downward in its distinctive landing configuration to give the pilots visibility over the sharp delta wing. The deceleration was noticeable and physical, the roar of the engines changing character as the thrust reversers deployed on landing, and the whole event had a drama and a precision to it that reminded you, even in those final moments, that this was not an ordinary machine. It was something crafted at the very edge of what was possible, and even its arrival at the gate had a quality of controlled theatre about it. And then, of course, came the moment that no Concorde passenger ever entirely ceased to find remarkable. You had left London at, let us say, 10:30 in the morning. You had eaten an exceptional meal, drunk a very good Burgundy, looked out of the window at the curve of the Earth and the darkness of the upper atmosphere, and now, as you stepped off the aircraft at JFK, you checked your watch and found that it was 9:15 in the morning. You had arrived before you left. The clock had run backward. Time itself had been defeated, temporarily and triumphantly, by a machine designed by engineers in Bristol and Toulouse who had refused to accept that the impossible was impossible. There is a line that the writer and journalist Barnaby Conrad used to describe the Concorde experience that has always struck me as both accurate and oddly moving. He wrote that flying on Concorde was not like flying at all. It was like being given, briefly, the power of gods, the power to move faster than thought, faster than sound, faster than the turning of the day, and then, inevitably, giving it back. Now we need to talk about why Concorde is gone. Because it is gone, and has been since 2003, and the story of its disappearance is as fascinating and as melancholy as the story of its existence. The beginning of the end, though no one knew it at the time, came on the 25th of July in the year 2000. Air France Flight 4590 departed from Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, bound for New York. During the takeoff roll, the aircraft ran over a metal strip that had fallen from a Continental Airlines DC-10 that had departed minutes earlier. The strip punctured a tire on Concorde's left landing gear. The debris from the exploding tire struck the underside of the wing with tremendous force, damaging a fuel tank and igniting a catastrophic fire. The aircraft, already committed to takeoff, climbed briefly and then fell onto a hotel in the town of Gonesse, north of Paris. All 109 people on board, passengers and crew, were killed, along with 4 more on the ground. It was the only fatal accident in Concorde's commercial history, which is remarkable given the complexity of the aircraft and the conditions in which it operated. But it was devastating. The entire Concorde fleet was grounded. The accident investigation identified several contributing factors. The metal strip on the runway, clearly, was the primary trigger. But investigators also identified a weakness in the fuel tank lining that had been known about and imperfectly addressed over the years of the aircraft's service life. Modifications were made, new tire design was implemented, new Kevlar lining was added to the fuel tanks, and in November 2001, Concorde returned to service, to a reception that was both cautious and deeply emotionally warm. The passengers who returned to Concorde after its restoration were making a statement. Or they were saying that this aircraft, this experience, this extraordinary thing that no other machine in the world could offer, was worth the risk, worth the history, worth the loyalty. But the world had changed. The September 11th attacks had occurred 6 weeks before Concorde's return to service in 2001, and the entire luxury travel market was reeling. Corporate travel budgets had been cut. Transatlantic business had contracted. The pool of passengers willing and able to pay Concorde's ticket prices had shrunk considerably, and the aircraft itself was aging. The original Concorde airframes had entered service in 1976. By 2003, the youngest of them were more than 20 years old, and the structural maintenance costs were rising steeply. Airbus, which had inherited the maintenance obligations from the original manufacturers, now announced that it would no longer provide support for the aircraft, citing the small number of airframes and the escalating costs of continued certification. Without manufacturer support, continued airworthiness certification would have been impossibly complex and expensive. Both British Airways and Air France made the decision in 2003 to retire the fleet. The final British Airways commercial service landed at Heathrow on the 24th of October 2003 to scenes of extraordinary public emotion. Thousands of people gathered on the viewing terraces and around the perimeter of the airport to watch. The 3 final British Airways Concordes made a coordinated arrival, sweeping over London in formation before landing in sequence. The cabin crew were in tears. Many of the passengers were in tears. And even the engineers who had serviced the aircraft for decades were visibly moved. It was the end of something that had seemed, for 30 years, to be the beginning of something. the beginning of supersonic commercial travel becoming routine, becoming the standard, becoming the future that everyone had confidently expected. That future never came. And this is perhaps the most extraordinary and the most poignant aspect of the entire Concorde story. When Concorde retired in 2003, the world did not move on to something faster. It moved backward. The fastest regular passenger service in the world today operates at roughly the same speed as it did in 1958, when the Boeing 707 entered service. We have better screens, better food, wider seats, and better connectivity. But we are not faster. In fact, in terms of city-to-city journey times, accounting for the expansion of airports, the growth of security procedures, and the sprawl of modern urban infrastructure, we are arguably slower than passengers of the 1960s were on some routes. Concorde's retirement was not a step on a staircase of progress. It was the end of a branch of evolution that simply ceased to continue. The reasons for this are both economic and political. The sonic boom problem, which restricted Concorde to over-water routes and prevented it from ever serving the vast domestic American market or flying direct between European cities, was never solved. The fuel consumption of supersonic flight is, by its nature, dramatically higher than subsonic flight at equivalent payload, and in an era of rising fuel prices and growing environmental consciousness, that equation becomes harder and harder to justify commercially. The development costs of a new supersonic airliner are, in the 21st century, probably an order of magnitude greater than what Britain and France spent in the 1960s, and no government or consortium of investors has yet been willing to commit that kind of capital to a project whose commercial viability remains uncertain. There are companies today, in 2026, that are working on supersonic passenger aircraft. Boom Supersonic, an American startup, has attracted significant attention and investment for its Overture aircraft, which promises speeds of Mach 1.7 and a return to transatlantic supersonic travel sometime in the late 2020s or early 2030s. NASA is developing its X-59 experimental aircraft, designed to test whether supersonic flight over land is possible with an acceptable noise signature. These are real projects, backed by real engineers and real money. But they are not Concorde. They are not yet real. And even if they succeed, they will arrive into a world that has spent more than 20 years without supersonic commercial aviation, a world that has, in some ways, forgotten what it means to make speed and luxury synonymous. The 14 production Concordes that served with British Airways and Air France were retired to museums and airport displays around the world. You can see them today at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, at the Intrepid Sea Air and Space Museum in New York, at the Fleet Air Arm Museum in Yeovilton, at Le Bourget outside Paris, at Barbados, at Manchester, at Bristol, and at Edinburgh. They sit in their retirement with the peculiar dignity of objects that have outlived their era, beautiful still, impossibly sleek, the narrow fuselage and the drooped nose and the great delta wing speaking of an ambition that has not yet been equaled. You can walk up to them, touch the skin that once ran at 120 degrees Celsius over the North Atlantic, look through the small oval windows into the cabin where princes and presidents and captains of industry ate smoked salmon and drank Chateau d'Yquem at 60,000 feet, and feel the full weight of what has been lost. There is something almost heartbreaking about a retired Concorde. Not because the aircraft itself arouses pity, it does not. It is too magnificent for that. But because of what it represents about human ambition and its relationship with human patience. Concorde was built on the conviction that the world wanted speed, that luxury and velocity were a natural combination, that the future would inevitably belong to those who moved fastest, and for 3 decades that conviction was vindicated. And then it wasn't. And the world discovered that it preferred, on the whole, a cheaper ticket, and a wider seat and a screen to watch films on, to the dark blue sky above 60,000 feet, and the curve of the earth in the window, and the impossible arithmetic of arriving before you left. I am not sure that is a loss that we have fully reckoned with. I think there are a great many people of a certain age and a certain sensibility, who feel, when they think about Concorde, I'm something that is not quite nostalgia and not quite grief, but something in between. A sense that the world was briefly, gloriously more than it needed to be. A sense that someone, somewhere, once decided that the goal of human ingenuity was not merely to get people from one place to another, but to make the journey itself an act of elevation, in every possible sense of that word. Consider what Concorde represented in the context of its time. The 1970s were, in many respects, a decade of contraction and disillusionment in the Western world. The oil crisis, the end of the post-war economic boom, the shadow of Vietnam, the beginning of the long cultural argument about limits and sustainability. And into this world every day. And Concorde took off from Heathrow and JFK and climbed to 60,000 feet and crossed the ocean in 3.5 hours, defying gravity, defying time, defying the very idea that limits were real. It was extravagant in an era that was learning to be frugal. It was fast in an era that was slowing down. It was confident in an era that was riddled with doubt. And perhaps that is partly why it endures so powerfully in the imagination of those who lived through its years. It was a reminder that the extraordinary was possible. That technology, when combined with genuine ambition and genuine craft, could produce something that made you feel, for a few hours, that you were living at the furthest edge of what human beings were capable of. The people who flew Concorde regularly speak about it with a consistency that is striking. Not merely as a pleasant memory, not merely as a fond recollection of comfortable seats and good champagne, but as something that changed their understanding of what experience could be. A British politician who flew Concorde dozens of times over a 20-year career in government told an interviewer, years after the aircraft's retirement, that the feeling of boarding Concorde never became routine, never became ordinary, never ceased to feel like an event. That even after the 50th flight, the 100th flight, there was still something about the takeoff, the acceleration, the climb, the moment when the Mach meter clicked past 1.0 and kept going, that produced in him a feeling he could only describe as gratitude. Gratitude that he had lived in a time when this was possible. As gratitude that human beings had been bold enough and clever enough to build it. And this, perhaps, is the most important thing to understand about Concorde. It was not just an aircraft, it was a statement about what we believed we could be. It was an argument, made in aluminium and titanium and Rolls-Royce engineering and French aerodynamics, that the business of living could be conducted at the highest possible level. That excellence was not a luxury in the pejorative sense of the word, not a frivolous indulgence, but an aspiration worth pursuing for its own sake. That the difference between arriving at your destination in 7 hours and arriving in 3.5 was not merely a matter of time saved, but a matter of what kind of world you wanted to inhabit, what kind of choices you wanted human civilization to make. We have not made those choices since 2003. We have made other choices, some of them wise and some of them merely convenient, and the sky above the North Atlantic is quieter for it, and the passengers who cross it do so at the same speed their grandparents did in slightly more comfortable seats, with better entertainment systems, eating food that is sometimes, on the better carriers, quite good. And it is fine, it is perfectly adequate, it is the world we have chosen. But every now and then, when the light is right, and the sky is that particular shade of deep blue that appears in the early morning over the Atlantic, and you are sitting in your economy seat, watching the map on the screen in front of you inch its way across the ocean, you might find yourself thinking of a time when 100 people a day sat at 60,000 feet, on above the weather, above the noise, above the ordinary world, with champagne in their glasses and the curve of the earth in their windows, moving at twice the speed of sound between two of the greatest cities in the world, and felt, with absolute justification, that they were the luckiest people alive. So I want to leave you today with a question, and I want you to think about it genuinely, not as an idle hypothetical, but as a real question about values and choices and what we want from the world we live in. If Concorde were flying today, and you could afford the ticket, however you need to imagine that, would you fly it? Would you choose the 3.5-hour crossing, the champagne, the dark blue sky, the curve of the earth, the impossible arithmetic of the clocks? Or would you prefer the longer flight, the better entertainment, the wider seat, the lower price? And if your answer is that you would choose Concorde without a second's hesitation, then perhaps the more important question is this: what does that tell us about what we have lost and whether we even know it? I think about Concorde often. I think about the engineers in Bristol and Toulouse who spent their careers solving problems that had never been solved before. I think about the cabin crew who served champagne at 60,000 feet with a warmth and a professionalism that left passengers feeling not merely transported, but genuinely cared for. I think about the passengers, famous and ordinary alike, who looked out of those small oval windows at the dark sky above and the curve of the world below, and felt, in that moment, something that no other experience in civilian life could give them. And I think about what it means that all of that is gone, that those aircraft sit in museums now, silent and magnificent and completely still, while the world they inhabited has moved on to other preoccupations and other speeds and other ambitions. Concorde was imperfect. It was loud. Its sonic boom was genuinely antisocial. Its fuel consumption was genuinely extravagant. Its tickets were genuinely beyond the reach of the vast majority of the people alive during its lifetime. None of these things are myths or exaggerations. But imperfect things can still be magnificent. And magnificent things, when they disappear, leave a shape in the air that takes a very long time to fill. Thank you for joining me today on what I hope has felt, at least a little, like a real journey. A journey into the history of the most extraordinary commercial aircraft ever built, and into the world it inhabited, and the experience it offered, and the particular kind of loss that its disappearance represents. If this video moved you, if it made you think, if it made you wish, even for a moment, that you could have been there, sitting in seat 1A with a glass of Laurent Perrier Grand Siècle in your hand, and the dark blue sky of the upper atmosphere above you, then I am glad. Because that is exactly why I make these videos. To remind us of what was. To honor what was done well, and to ask quietly but persistently whether we might find it in ourselves to do something like it again. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories like this one waiting for you, and stories of aircraft and experiences and worlds that existed at the furthest edge of what was possible and left their mark on everyone who encountered them. Leave a comment below, telling me which aspect of the Concorde experience you would most have wanted to live through. Was it the view from 60,000 feet, the food and the champagne, the sheer physical drama of the takeoff and the acceleration, the feeling of arriving before you left? I read every comment, and I am genuinely curious about what moves you about these stories. Share this video with anyone you know who loves history, aviation, the culture of fine travel, or simply the feeling of discovering that the world was once, briefly, more extraordinary than we remembered. Until next time.